right? So I want to go through a simple example and walk you through how this basically happens. So let's imagine for a moment that you have 3 employees, okay? And in this table, you can see that the first employee, they have different productivities. So the first employee can produce 15 units, and in that same amount of time, the second employee can produce 10, and the third employee can produce 8. Now, you can think of these as being 3 different employees with 3 different marginal productivities, or you can think of these as all being the same, having the same productivity, just as diminishing marginal productivity given the constraints of capital. And it doesn't, either way, either interpretation is just fine. So let's imagine for a moment that the price is $5, which is the good that you sell. That means that the first employee can produce 15 units at $5 a piece. The value to the employer of that employee is $75. And you go through the same kind of metric here. The value of the second employee is 50, the value of the third is 40. Now, if the wage is $5 an hour at 8 hours, then the net profit per employee is 75 minus 40 for the first employee, which is 35, 10, and 0. So if we were to then come in and say, actually, let's increase the minimum wage, what you'll find out is that the employment, or the productivity of each employee doesn't change. Just the amount of money that you have to pay them per hour. And if you go through and redo the calculations of net profit, you see that the first employee falls from 35 to 27. The second employee falls from 10 to 2. And this is the key part about the minimum wage, is that third employee falls from 0 to -8. And the reason that this is important is that if you take the perspective of the employer, they're actually $8 an hour better off, or $8 a day better off by just getting rid of that second employee. This employee is now a cost instead of a benefit, right? Employee 3 ends up getting fired. There's another aspect of this that's important. You can have average productivity increase even though you're losing one employee, right? So that brings us to kind of the lessons of the minimum wage. The first one is that there's no change in productivity, okay? Implementing a minimum wage does not increase the amount they're able to produce. It just changes how much you have to pay them. The second lesson of the minimum wage is it doesn't force employees to pay everybody the new wage. It forces employers to pay everybody that they choose to keep the new wage, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, the real minimum wage is 0, right? The third lesson of the minimum wage is that it tends to benefit the more productive workers at the expense of the less productive workers. It doesn't actually benefit the employee at the expense of the employer. It benefits the more productive employees at the expense of the less productive employees, right? And the worst part about that is the more productive employees don't need the help, right? If we were to follow them through time, eventually they would have been better off anyway, right? And this entire thing, there are additional complications. This process may take time, and there are other quantity effects that we'll actually get into in a minute. So this is kind of the standard theory we have behind the minimum wage. So let's talk about the empirics for a minute. There is kind of this notion floating around that there is no evidence of an employment effect in the minimum wage. Well, that's simply just not true. If you go prior to the 1990s, there's a list of over 100 papers that I'll be happy to show you, nearly all of which find some sort of negative elasticity between an increase in the minimum wage and employment. Newmark and Shirley, which is a new National Bureau of Economic Research paper, 2021, looked at 60 papers since 1990. They have 4 key conclusions. The first is that there's a clear preponderance of negative estimates in the literature. Basically what that means is that if you increase the minimum wage, you're going to decrease employment. The evidence is even stronger for teens and young adults, and as well as the less educated. The evidence from the studies of directly affected workers points more strongly to negative employment effects, and the evidence from studies of low-wage industries is less one-sided. So basically what they do is they line up all of the papers that have been published since 1990, and they say, okay, what were the estimated effects of the minimum wage? Was there a negative effect on employment? And this is what you're left with. You can see that there is a clear preponderance of evidence. These dotted lines are both the mean and median estimate of those elasticities. So to say that there's no evidence that there's a negative employment effect from an increase in the minimum wage is simply not true, right? You have a few wages. Notice that many of these up here where you have a positive effect on employment are also statistically insignificant. Now, you may be thinking, well, perhaps all of these are older, so let's look and see what happens if we arrange these papers by date instead of by elasticity estimate. And this is the resulting figure. So again, we see that these negative estimates with respect to an increase in the minimum wage causing unemployment is pretty consistent through time as well. To kind of see this, I want to step back for a second. Let's talk about the optimal experiment. The optimal experiment, so if we were to go through and empirically test whether or not an increase in the minimum wage causes unemployment, the optimal test would be to take a bunch of people at random and impose a minimum wage on that person at a random time. Well, for obvious reasons, we can't do this, right? So you can't have these types of what are called randomized controlled trials, or random treatment trials in basically social sciences. So what we're left with, if we wanted to truly identify the cause or the effect of a minimum wage increase, we have to rely on other sources of variation, usually what we call natural experiments or exogenous variation. One that I'm going to talk about here in a second uses what's called a synthetic control group. So effectively what you do is you're going to say they're going to increase the minimum wage in Seattle. What I do is I build a fictional city that looks a lot like Seattle, and then I make sure that that fictional city looks a lot like Seattle through time, and then Seattle gets treated with a minimum wage. What happens to Seattle versus that fictional city that was supposed to represent Seattle? And this is exactly what was done in the minimum wage. And Jardim, I don't know exactly how to pronounce that name, in 2017. The reason I focus on this particular paper is that it had access to better data, right? Typically what you don't have is individual data, how many hours they work, where they work, and all of that. This particular case did. And they had three findings that I think are relatively important. The first is that wages increased by about 3%, which is what we would expect if you're going to increase the minimum wage. But hours fell by 6%. There's that quantity effect that we were talking about again. The net result is a fall in monthly income by about $125 on average, right? And this is for everybody making less than $19 an hour. Finally, this minimum wage hurts worse the people who have yet to enter the labor force, because one of the things that you can do as an employer, if your labor costs go up, is transition to capital. So, okay, you're confronted with a minimum wage. You may take the hit right now, but it prevents you from hiring people in the future. And this is the effect that they find the largest. So this is what it looks like. These blue lines are the synthetic or the kind of the fictional city that they built to match Seattle. The black line is Seattle. The first red line is the initial treatment period. So you can see that prior to the minimum wage, the blue line and the black line kind of resemble one another, and then about 8 months later, they start to split. Seattle has a higher average wage, which again is what we would expect if low-wage workers are the first ones let go. Finally, you see the number of jobs. Seattle loses more jobs relative to the synthetic control post the treatment period. You see the same thing in terms of hours worked and payroll, right? The fundamental thing that we're seeing here is this quantity effect, this employment effect from an increase in the minimum wage. And according to the cost-benefit analysis they do here, it actually hurt the lowest group worse, because yes, they got a higher wage, but they had the reduction in hours overpowered that higher wage. So the net result was a loss in income. So let's talk for a second why it might be difficult. So that's not to say that there aren't papers that say, oh, we find no effect. but there's a reason it might be difficult to find an effect from a minimum wage. The first is you're always looking at marginal changes, right? We never go from 0 to $15. We always go from $7.75 to $7.50, or from $6.48 to $6.92, right? And whenever you're looking at something statistically, you have noise, right? And then you have the signal. And in employment, right, in labor markets, there's a lot of noise. Right? Just the cyclicality in seasons makes it difficult to pinpoint in these super small changes, right? And economists, for some reason or another, just never run power tests. The other reason that you might not find anything when you look empirically is that the changes in the minimum wage may not be binding. And what do I mean by that? In this left graph, you see this is the minimum wage over time, and you see it growing steadily. But if you control for inflation, right, if you adjust for inflation, you see that in real terms, the minimum wage is falling, right? The end result is actually probably reflected in a falling unemployment rate among black 16 to 19-year-olds since the 1980s. So if you jump back to this point here, you can see that the minimum wage in real terms actually falls right about 1980, and that's consistent with a falling unemployment rate. Is that my time? So we're going to go ahead and let Professor Cox.
Thank you. Let's see if I can flip this one here. How about that? You guys hear me all right? Let's see. Where was my slides? Where at? Oh, here we go. Perfect.
You got to move it to the other screen. There you
go. Oh, I got you. We do a slideshow here. Okay, so welcome all. Thanks for coming out on a Friday night. I know you have other things you could be doing, so the opportunity cost, so to speak, might have been more significant than otherwise. But I'm here to argue and maybe try to convince you a little bit to argue in favor of the minimum wage for a reason or two that we'll kind of look at. So tonight I want to keep it real simple. I'm going to talk to you about two things mostly. I'm going to focus on that. In terms of cost-benefit analysis, this is what I thought the framing of the debate was supposed to be. I'm going to argue that minimum wages do have benefits that outweigh the costs. Not that there aren't costs associated with it. Of course there are. We know there's no such thing as a free lunch, et cetera, et cetera. But there are benefits that are oftentimes undervalued or underestimated, while the costs are exaggerated or hyped up or overestimated, at least in my opinion and the opinion of many who've done lots of research. So I'm glad to hear at least we got the graphs and charts covered from the first presenter, so I've kept those to a minimum. I do have paper citations I made available to the organizers of the debate, so if you want to check those out, you can read them and look at not just individual studies with synthetic cities, but you can look at metadata analysis where they've studied hundreds, if not thousands, of individual minimum wage studies and see what they find. You average all that out, see what the empirical data says, and maybe it can help you change your mind or come to a conclusion in that sense. This is the issue. It's an endless controversy, especially in economics, back and forth for not just decades, but longer than that. Do minimum wages cause unemployment? Do they cause a rise in prices? These are the two biggest costs that people generally tend to worry about in terms of raising the minimum wage. Are prices going to go up? Are people going to lose their job? Of course, if you pay people more money, it's going to benefit them, but what about the people who are kind of left on the outside? Endless controversy and debate, especially about the models, about how these subjective models are built and put together, who's done this research, where it gets published. There's metadata analysis that I've read. I've read studies that look at the selection bias in the publications themselves. So you've got academic journals selecting who gets published and who doesn't. Tends to skew the results that tend to get published. So it's very tricky when you hear somebody say, especially if you look at all the papers before 1990, you tend to find that everybody says unemployment's going to go up. You start looking at things that have been published since then, and lots of real-world examples, you get a different picture. So I agree 1,000%. You have studies that say one thing, you have studies that say the other thing, you have studies that say there's no effects in the middle. And so I remember when I was an undergraduate in economics, I was listening to a podcast called Econ Talk with Russ Roberts from George Mason University, very libertarian right-wing school. He was collecting all the data. They did lots of studies. Even he was admitting and saying that this is kind of a dead issue in economics. There's never really going to be agreement because there's a problem with the statistical methods and the models that are built to try to measure these things. I think the point was made at the very end. It's very difficult to ascertain these effects, especially in the demand that's going to get changed, the prices that are going to go up, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a difficult thing. Sociological experiments don't exist in the real world. We don't have randomized trials. We have to kind of try to do what we can do to ascertain information from a very noisy sort of search situation. But let's look about that. So I want to talk a little bit about what empirical realities have convinced me. I'll point you to those and you can take those into account. I also want to talk a little bit about the theory that's around it. So usually you've got the cost and the benefits couched in those terms, right? What can you expect to gain from raising the minimum wage? What can you expect it to cost you, right? So entitled The Circumstances Here Today, I want to make two main points. First, I'm going to argue for a fair amount of skepticism about the economic theories themselves used to attack the minimum wage. So you heard a lot of neoclassical mainstream economic arguments about supply and demand. You saw the graphs. You saw the supply and the demand and the unemployment there. The classic explanation of where that thing, but then there was something very interesting towards the end of the introduction that I picked up on. All of a sudden, instead of unemployment, it was drops in employment that we're going to look at. So now all of a sudden, the level of employment's gone down. That implies a shift of that demand curve, not the actual disequilibrium in the labor market itself. So you want to be careful. If you're shifting a supply or demand curve, you're just picking out a new equilibrium point. And it's true that employment levels may go down as a result of changing the cost structure or something for a business. But what you tend not to find in the empirical reality is this unemployment, the boogeyman of unemployment. And the same is kind of true of prices as well. So I want to talk about that, skepticism of why these economic theories tend to sort of fail or whatnot. And you'll tell me when I run out of time, I'm sure. So, okay, perfect. So that's one thing. And so I'm hoping that's going to provide you with at least a little bit of ammunition to know about, so you can make a better educated. I noticed that I'm at a disadvantage from the first poll that we took. So hopefully we can change a couple minds and we switch it around by the end. So I'll say a couple things. Excuse me. I want to maybe go through, I only have a couple slides here. Like I said, no charts or anything like that. So we'll see what I can get through in the introduction. And then I'll kind of save my time to respond to the points kind of made from the other side, is how I kind of organized it. So is neoclassical economic theory convincing? Maybe. As an undergraduate, or some of us are graduate students in the master's program, you might have taken a couple minutes to kind of think about this question in general. But if not, maybe perhaps now is a kind of good time, right? You may have heard the criticisms or the ideas that these economic theories, they do a poor job, okay, describing historical realities. So they don't do good describing history. They don't do a good job describing present day realities, right? And they don't do a really great job in predicting the future realities either. So with all the econometric studies we've done with minimum wages and unemployment, they still have trouble making a good prediction about what you expect to find when we raise this minimum wage from 7.25 to 8.49 or 15, et cetera, et cetera. The other point I want to make real quickly too, you might have seen it or you might have glimpsed it from that graph there. Going back to the 80s when the minimum wage, if you tie it to productivity, minimum wage would be over $20 an hour right now. So if you're concerned about fighting for $15 an hour now, imagine the political capital that you're wasting and expending trying to argue for something that's not even barely halfway to where it would have otherwise been. So it's kind of politically and sociologically, it's a loser of a conversation, of a debate to even have. Like this stuff has been settled quite a long time ago. So there's that to sort of think about. So our economic theories, right, if you think about the neoclassical economic fails to predict any of these things like the financial collapse, 2008 and 9, the current economic struggles we're experiencing right now. First, they're gonna have to decide what the unemployment rate is. Is it lower or higher than 6% like they're reporting? Is inflation higher than the 1 or 2 or 3% that they're reporting? I don't know. It seems like it is to most people who look at it. But there's a lot of difficulties in explaining why that would be the case. There's a lack of understanding or theory that explains most any business cycle. Where do the booms and busts come from? According to our neoclassical experts who tell us that our unemployment is going to be caused when we raise the minimum wage. All of these sorts of things are very problematic, all right? So if you think about the failure to do any of that or predict that, right, maybe it's just time to admit that they don't do the best job in explaining why these things kind of occurred, right? So why exactly are these the theories that we rely upon when we have this debate here? We have to go through the supply and demand. We have to go through the shifting supply and demand curves, the disequilibrium in the labor market that probably doesn't exist anyway. I mean, if anybody's been to a labor market or tried to get employment, you'll probably be aware that there's not one wage out there, some market set wage that you're going to be earning when you get your job, right? Very few people get to negotiate your wage in the first place. It would be nice if there was some kind of office you'd go to, sign a piece of paper, say, I'm here in the labor market, I'd like the job, where's it at? That doesn't really exist. There are employers, there are employees, and people have to kind of match that up on their own. So that's a thing to sort of think about. Arguments from this school of thought, right? They predict the unemployment, they predict the price increases. The structural reforms like automation is something you hear a lot about. I didn't hear it yet tonight. But what happens when McDonald's has to pay $15 an hour is supposedly they're gonna hire a bunch of robots, right? Nobody's gonna be able to get to work as a cashier at McDonald's anymore and make French fries or fill the Cokes up. Lots of effects like that. Those are what I'm counting and considering the cost. These are the things you should be thinking of in terms of what is a minimum wage increase going to cost, right? And so when you do look for these negative impacts in the empirical results, very sketchy, right? I wish I could tell you that they weren't true. But in large amounts, like you simply don't find them. You don't find a good case, right? If you're gonna take this case before a court of law, let's say, it's gonna be hard for you to argue that you can find these things there. You can make studies with synthetic cities and imaginary type things, or you could do a study where you measure the city of Seattle did raise their wage, how did it affect the city right next to them? And I noticed that I'm out of time, so I'll wrap it up there and pick up when we come back. Here we go. Let me pull this over here.
Okay, so I start now? So what I want to do is I want to cover a few things that Professor Cox brought up, and to clarify a few different things. One, all of the empirical work is atheoretical. I don't need theory for that. This is looking at what actually happened, right? And I mean, to the extent to what we're looking at, how much did employment change in this city relative to this city, I don't need theory. Right? So in a sense, attacking neoclassical theory for not being an accurate reflection of the real world fails on 2 points. One, at least with respect to the empirical work, it's irrelevant. And two, with respect to the modeling, it doesn't, a model to be useful doesn't need to be an accurate representation. It just needs to be useful for what it's being used for, right? And a good example of this is consider a map, right? So I have a map out in front of you. You use a map to find a way to get to a place. It is nowhere near a close representation of the actual world, but for what it is used for, it is still very useful. I would also argue that if you don't want to use the empirics, then let's simply rely on logic. The idea that there's an employment effect with respect to an increase in the minimum wage simply comes from the fact that there's a diminishing marginal utility or diminishing marginal benefit. The idea is that the demand curve must be downward sloping, right? It has to be because of diminishing marginal benefit. To say that there is no employment effect or no quantity effect from an increase in the minimum wage, what does that curve look like, right? And at least with respect to people, even standard economists who consistently argue that there's no employment effect with respect to the minimum wage, they always say at this point, right? any economist, if you push them hard enough, if you back them against a wall, they're going to concede that eventually, if you keep increasing that minimum wage, there must be an employment effect. There has to be, right? Which means that implicit in that argument, logically, it must be the case they're examining a demand curve that looks something like this, right? That over the wages that we're considering, the relative elasticity or inelasticity is such that a change in the wage, right, has a very small quantity effect. But let's sit back and think logically for a second. Does that even make sense, right? So consider every time that you've been employed and you have an operation, and every operation probably has a bunch of employees that range in types of productivity. So who is the one worker that we can't get rid of? It's the guy pushing the broom and gathering the trash. That's the guy that is absolutely indispensable. No, that doesn't make sense, and it doesn't comport with anything we've ever experienced. Most likely the case, the demand curve looks something like this, such that your more productive workers are relatively inelastic, and it's your less productive workers that have some sort of quantity effect or demand effect. And that's exactly what we see in the empirical literature. Who is hurt the worst? The lowest skilled, least experienced employees. All right, so this is what I mean when I say that there has to be a demand. What I find interesting is that the whole purpose behind the minimum wage, or at least its stated purpose, is to help people get to a living wage, right? But the problem is that it misses the point. The reason they're not paid a living wage is because they are not productive enough. So implementing a minimum wage is like telling a farmer who can't produce enough food to feed their family that you don't even get to farm at all, right? It's counterproductive in the sense of the word. I mean, it's by definition hurting the very group of people that it's stated to help the best or the most, right? So no matter how you want to look at it, you can throw out the models. That's fine. Let's look at what actually happened. Let's look at the empirical work. I also think it's a little disingenuous to bring in macroeconomics, because I think that, fine, you know, macroeconomists do a poor job of basically predicting macro business cycles. That's fair, and I think we'd actually agree. But this is an entirely different beast. I mean, you're comparing apples and oranges with that critique. How much time have I got? 30? Okay, well, I guess we'll call it for a second. Pardon?
Okay, perfect. Let's switch these back real quick, right quick. I thought I would. This one here. Okay, perfect. So just as a quick response, I think it's interesting, the example we used, the person who can't get rid of the quick was the person pushing the broom or taking out the trash. If we just change the rhetoric just a little bit and call these people maybe essential workers, I think over the past year we might have learned a lesson or two about these essential workers and which workers we can and can't do without. Had these people not shown up at grocery stores and stocked their shelves, these people are often paid the lowest wages, even though their work is oftentimes most essential. I'm going to point that out. Actually, the people that we worry least about in terms of wages and the way that we pay them are people who actually perform very essential functions that cause the economy to kind of turn in the first place. I don't think it's disingenuous to bring macroeconomics in to a debate like this if we're talking about unemployment. I mean, Keynes's book, unemployment's right there in the title. When you talk about macroeconomics like inflation or unemployment, prices changing, this is macroeconomics. This is an economics club. So I feel at least partially justified. If it was a sneaky trick or a low blow, I apologize a little bit to take it back. In terms of what's relevant or not, in terms of let's just use the models or the empiricism, that's exactly what I propose to do. I have some slides. The stuff I'm pulling from Card and Kruger did a huge analysis in like 95 where they looked at all this stuff. They said, let's actually look at what happens. Not between Seattle and a synthetic city that we cooked up, right? Let's look at what happens. Like, you went to graduate school in Kansas City. Half that city's on the side, the Kansas side, half the other city's on the Missouri side. So there's lots of natural experiments you can look at when you change tax rates, when you change minimum wages. If you raise the minimum wage in Springfield, Ohio, what happens to employment in Urbana or Dayton or Fairfield, the places that are right next to it and around it? So lots of interesting ways. So I'm not saying get rid of the models or stop using statistics. I'm just saying let's think about the way the models actually purport to the real world, not an artificial kind of experiment. So those things also. Excuse me. In terms of response, I can't think of any other thing that I wanted to bring up there. So I just push forward a little bit and go through a little thing. In terms of unemployment itself, isn't it neoclassical economics that tells us things like frictional unemployment, structural unemployment? These things, the free market fixes these for us, right? Frictional unemployment is just people moving from job to job. They've moved from Indiana to Ohio. They've made free choices. They're individuals. They're rational utility maximizers, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't have to worry about that. That's just structural unemployment. What do they tell you when they want to pass a new free trade bill, right? What did they tell us in the 90s when they wanted to get rid of all the manufacturing jobs in places like Ohio and Indiana and Michigan? Well, these jobs are not efficient enough. We're going to send them overseas. We're going to specialize, and you're going to transform. Creative destruction, it's called. When certain industries can't perform well enough, the employment tends to go away. But it's not a problem because, capitalism is dynamic. There's entrepreneurialism is going to kick in, and these jobs are going to be, the people working these jobs are going to be eventually working or employed in other sectors that are more productive, more profitable, and better. So again, we have a theory that explains this. So why is it then, when we want to do something about the minimum wage, it's expected to cause unemployment? Why is it a problem? Is a question I would like to hear an answer to. Because if I'm a good neoclassical, I've been trained, I've been to university, I've studied economics, unemployment's not really a problem. Same with inflation, right? There's, productivity. I will go back to responses as well. The argument about being paid your productivity is not something I subscribe to. That's very much a theoretical kind of result. So even if you're trying to put the theory aside, so to speak, and say that the theory is irrelevant or you can't criticize a model or a theory based on its assumptions, I think absolutely you can, right? The idea that people are paid their marginal productivity or that capital is paid an interest rate according to its productivity is very much a theoretical claim. And if there's a problem with that theory, there's a problem with that theory. So there's lots of interesting contradictions between these sorts of outcomes, right? So in case you're keeping track, your normal economic theory tells you you don't worry about unemployment if you're trying to pass policies to address the problem of unemployment. I'm sure you've all remembered when there is a recession or the economy is not doing so well, the first thing they tell you is that there's a free market to kind of fix this, don't you worry about it thing. But if you want to pass a minimum wage, then unemployment is something that can't be tolerated. Oh my gosh, people are going to lose their jobs. But not the same thing you hear about, when you've got the thing. What about the NIRU, the non-inflationary rate of unemployment? All of these things are kind of in the milieu, so to speak. So to pretend like they're not pertinent to the conversation or that you're just looking at the data or the empirical realities is a little bit misleading, I think. Ooh, excuse me, apologies. So what do these studies I'm talking about actually say happen when the minimum wage goes up, right? One thing they tend to find, and so again, a meta-study is a study of many studies put together. I've sent two to the organizers of the debate. You can look at them. One is from the UK, published in the International Journal of Business Relations. They did a meta-study of some 60 United States unemployment studies. There was another one published in the United States, more recent as well as that. Most of them tend to, again, look at this thing from Carden-Krueger, which is kind of like a mainstay staple. Unfortunately, I don't have graphs or bar charts or anything for you to sort of look at. But what are some stylistic kind of results that you find when you look at these things? There is a persistent and statistically significant finding that wages go up for those who are affected. So you raise the minimum wage and lo and behold, people make more money. And that makes sense because if you were making $7.25 an hour, now you're making 15, guess what's gonna happen to your paycheck? If you're lucky enough to keep your job. Now I know we've got the cost to worry about, the unemployment and the prices. But maybe you pay more prices for the Big Mac or whatever else, but you do make more money. And that is something that's on average, let's say, found. So we're looking at like maybe 1,000 different employment studies based on minimum wages. Let's look at all the results and kind of average them up and build a data set of actual studies rather than just, et cetera, et cetera. The economic effects, the unemployment and inflation rate, are either positive in some cases, negative in others, or they're statistically insignificant. This is something that you find. The statistical analysis will be very close. The confidence intervals will be very much on the margin. Or when they are found to be statistically significant, right, the impacts will also be very small. So you will see, like, for example, if you find positive price increases, you'll find very small percentage increase per 1% increase in the minimum wage. That's kind of how they measure it and try to model that one. So sometimes prices go up, sometimes prices go down. Sometimes unemployment goes up, sometimes not so much. Further, these effects are oftentimes statistically insignificant when they are found and measured. And even if they are statistically significant, they're often very small in impact. And so this does not paint to me a compelling story or convincing kind of narrative of why you should be so worried about these price increases or unemployment that come through there. Am I okay? I'm not 2 minutes? Perfect. So why might it be that these predictions fail? Reductions in hours worked, reductions in non-wage benefits, reductions in training, changes to employee compensation, higher prices, improvements in efficiency, efficiency wage responses from employees, wage compression, reduction in profits, increases in demand, reduced turnover. All of these are theoretical reasons. All of these have specific studies done on them where they've analyzed these as reasons that would counteract the typical decreases in employment or decreases in increases in prices that you would tend to predict with our standard economic sort of theories. So at least 11 or 12 different reasons here. I pulled this straight out of one of the studies that I sent to your people here. You can look at those and see what happens. We did see a picture of a demand curve. I think the point was that there's absolutely no way that you could get increased productivity from employees. It turns out actually you can get increased productivity from your employees. It turns out sometimes if you pay them more money, they work a little bit extra hard. Sometimes if you take a management course and you learn how to deal with people and interact with people on a social level, you can get a little bit more out of them. So productivity does in fact change. It's not that you change the wage and the productivity has to stay exactly the same. That's a theoretical assumption that's like cooked in to the predictions that we want to raise. So simply raising the minimum wage, excuse me, I need a drink of water actually. I'm trying to blast through here really quick. So simply raising the minimum wage, while it does imply higher wage costs, it doesn't correlate one-to-one with these predictions that we have in terms of increased prices or increased unemployment. And again, watch this when we switch between unemployment versus employment levels, because we're talking about two different effects in that quote-unquote theoretical labor market that might or might not actually sort of exist. The real proposal, the recent proposal, $15 over 5 years, which just went down and got stripped out of the stimulus package, I'm sure you heard about it, was forecaster predicted, if you can believe the predictions. I'm out of time, so cut it off right there. Are we done now? We get one more? One more 5 minutes?
And then closing statements. Sure. Actually, I think because I go first, I go last. So I take my 5 now and then.
Privacy and recency biases.
I don't care. I don't think it really matters.
However you all want to do it is fine. I'm not.
All right, I'll just respond to this and then let him make his kind of closing arguments. We have a so let's see. I wanted to do a quick kind of response to some of the points that were made in first of all, what you're looking at here is a meta study. It's a meta study post 1990. It's, I think, over 60 some odd papers in the top tier journals of economics. This was published in January of 2021. I mean, this is the most recent meta-study. I would also like to point out that in some of the argument that he made, I guess this isn't fair, I'm going to use his research against him. In a sense, if you were to stack, this is the distribution of all of those point estimates that he spoke of. And this is the article that he cited. If you'll notice, a lot of those dots are on the second quadrant of that. There's a lot of negative over there. That's also a really poor way to represent that information. What you should do is build a histogram. That way you don't have overlapping dots, and you can actually see that the distribution of elasticity estimates are actually negative, which is exactly my point. So whether you want to look at his meta-study or my meta-study, the end result is exactly the same. There is a negative employment effect. And this is just an employment effect. I want to finally end on one last point. Pause my clock. Where's my slides? No timeout? Here. So I want to finish talking about why we might not find it difficult to find an employment effect when we start doing empirical work. The third is total employment. As the minimum wage increases, you can actually drag people who otherwise would have stayed out of the labor market, right? So in a sense, you can get bored retirees coming back to intern at a higher wage. You can get children from wealthy households who are likely to be better educated. So what happens is that the low-skilled people get kicked out of the labor market and they're replaced with people who otherwise wouldn't be in the labor market because the increased wage brought them in. So you wouldn't expect to find an employment effect. But this is why I keep talking about a quantity effect as opposed to an employment effect. All of this is perfectly consistent with neoclassical economics. Everything that I've talked about here is an effect basically coming from, this graph that I've showed is ceteris paribus, all else being equal. Effectively, the foundation of the argument that you just heard is he's violating ceteris paribus. If we're going to violate ceteris paribus, well then so do I. And I can show you why you might not see an employment effect in empirical research. So let's talk about some of the other quantity effects. I can lay off workers. I can lower working conditions. I can reduce benefits. I can kill sick pay. I can reduce retirement. I can have slower wage growth. I can reduce hours. I can hire fewer workers. I can transition to capital. The key here is to recognize that all of these things, all of these other things that an employer can turn to, hurt the very group of people we're trying to protect. Not only that, if you think about it from an efficiency standpoint, the employer has no incentive to focus on just one of them. He has every incentive to distribute it across all of them, making it incredibly difficult to find an employment effect. Because all of these papers, what they do is they go grab whatever data they can find, whatever they can stuff on the y-axis, and they say, okay, looking at just this one thing, do I see an effect of the minimum wage? Well, that's not really what you can do. And mind you, we still find it in that one thing. But what I'm saying is a lot of the effect is hidden in all of these other things that are also bad. And if we had access to the data, it would demonstrate that raising the minimum wage is really harmful to the lowest rung of the population, right? And I'm glad that you did bring up essential workers. And the reason that I'm glad of that is that look around, use your own experience. Who's the first people we replace? Walk through a grocery store. One person runs like 7, 8 checkouts now, right? Yeah, they're essential until a machine replaces them. Okay. I also appreciate that you bring up Carden-Kruger. Carden-Kruger was probably the one fundamental paper that started this entire literature. It just so happens to be flawed. The way Carden-Kruger did this is they sent out surveys, and they said prior to the survey, or prior to the change, they surveyed a bunch of businesses. Do you plan on laying off employers? And then they surveyed people after the change. Do you plan on laying off employers? But they had a sample selection problem because they only used the surveys that were on both sides of that change, right? You're not surveying the businesses that failed. You're not surveying the businesses that are no longer there. Further, Newmark, and I can't remember, Drew might know. Somebody came along a few years later and started looking at actual payroll data using the exact same identification strategy and found a negative employment effect. Oh, go ahead.
So yeah, I think that's a great point. So Card and Kruger did have a selection bias in their paper. So one of them that I included for citation for this thing that you can get from Josh or Travis actually is a paper that redid that exact same study with a different and found the exact same result. So the result, even though their study, and this is something that's typical in econometrics, everybody's going to argue with everybody else's methodology. There actually is no objective way to do statistics. It sounds like math and it looks cool, but the reason it really doesn't tend to convince a lot of people is because you have problems with the way, which variables are you going to include, which ones are you not? So it's great that you pointed that out, but there's actually been other studies that kind of confirm the results that have been done afterwards. So it's out there. Again, there's studies on both sides that say the exact same thing on different sides. There is an effect, there's not an effect. There's studies that say it's right in the middle, but it's not very statistically significant. So pick your study and which one you think convinces you. What I'm saying is maybe look at all of them and average them up and see what you kind of tend to find. I'm kind of losing my train of thought a little bit. There's a couple things I wanted to respond to. Oh, yeah, sure. I don't get a timeout either because I was unwilling to give you one as well. Where were we at here? The comment about all of this being consistent with neoclassical economic theory. I'm glad to hear that we agree. That's the problem I'm pointing out, is that there is a problem with neoclassical economic theory. I didn't slide it over to the other side of the screen. Apologies. So how about that? That's better. So that's kind of the main emphasis there. It is consistent with neoclassical economic theory, but the theory's not so great, guys. That's what I want you to develop a deep kind of perhaps skepticism, an ability to critically think about these theories. How well do they work historically? How well do they work presently? How much emphasis, how much trust do you want to put in the predictions that they come up with this time? There's that. I think I covered this one before. So we've got controversy around the empirical data and what is actually in there or out there. I was a little bit confused. In terms of employment effects, are they there or are they not? There are definitely employment effects. I'm not saying that there's not. I'm arguing that the benefits are going to outweigh the cost, right? So don't get confused in terms of that. I did have a question about the scatter plot of things. It looked like the mean was right around 0. So it may be true there's more of them on the left side, negative employment effects, but is it true that the average of those was right at 0? It looked like that spike was right there, right above 0. So it sounds like exactly what I'm pointing out. So we agree. You had like 7 reasons. I had 11. The only reason I wanted to point that out is because I had more reasons. They're actually the same. So there's lots of ways that employers can get around these increased costs. It's not like, oh my God, the cost of labor went up, I'm out of business, right? That's not what happens, right? McDonald's, the price of their buns goes up when sesame seeds are in short supply. They have to pay more, their costs go up. It's not like they lay everybody off to sort of get around that. And again, the question was, if unemployment's not such a bad thing for frictional or structural unemployment, why is it such a bad thing that we're worried about? Why is it that we're now concerned from a neoclassical economic theory? Why now are we concerned about the unemployed, the least among us, those at the bottom rung? It doesn't seem that, I thought I was out of time. I would love to hear why that would be the case. Because again, I've been brainwashed in neoclassical theory and I've come to understand frictional and structural unemployment's a good thing. Actually, it's creative destruction and capitalism is going to deliver the goods, so to speak, in the long run, over enough given time. There we go. The question still stands. But some proposed effects in terms of the benefits. We've talked a lot about the cost. Let's talk about a little bit about the benefits. The recent proposal, $15 over 5 years, was proposed to impact 32 million, even with employment effects. Some people are going to lose their job. It's still 32 people remain. 32 million, not 32 people, excuse me. Probably 32 people on this campus. 32 million people would have been impacted. Their wages would have went up. The majority of those workers that would have been seeing a wage increase, 59% of them happen to be women. Nearly one in four, full-time and part-time working women would have seen a pay increase. Nearly 1 in 4 of those women are Black or Latina. So if you're worried about systemic racism or discrimination, this is a policy that would have gone a long way to at least address that a little bit. So when we're worried about essential workers losing their job, getting hired or whatever, that was the other thing too. We had the store clerks, the only one person checking you out at the grocery store. Yeah, it's all good and fine until it gets automated. Those jobs get automated anyway as soon as it becomes cost-benefit profitable to do so. So keeping the minimum wage at 0 is not going to prevent companies from automating low-skill jobs away in the future. This is an effect you're going to see over time, regardless of the policy that's there, at least from my perspective. So you've got a lot of women. 1 in 4 of these women are minority. Close to 65% of women who work for minimum wages are head of households. So changing this policy, giving them a wage increase, is going to have a dramatic effect on things like child poverty, family poverty, people's ability to supply and take care of themselves and their families. So these are benefits that you should probably consider and think about, or I would hope you would. Anyway, so when we talk about, are we hurting the least among us, as I think I heard, or people with the lowest skilled jobs are the first to go, the essential workers, et cetera, and minimum wages actually hurt them? No. A good way to help people at the bottom who don't make much money is to give them more money, perhaps. And that's something we could maybe put in any kind of metric model. Fire that computer up and see how that comes up. How do you help people who don't have much money? Maybe give them some more money. How can you bring that about? It's not like anybody grows up saying, I want to work at McDonald's. I hope I get through school, I hope I get to university, and I get one of those minimum wage jobs, right? So why are we worried so much about protecting and maintaining this employment level of low-skilled labor? The final thing to think about is that these minimum wages aren't even really binding. Like, notice the unemployment came when you put the price of the wage above the equilibrium. So you put a price floor, if you put it above whatever equilibrium rates in that market, that's when you would have this unemployment problem. Very few people make minimum wages. It's very hard, I think, to try to argue that these things would be binding in the idealized theoretical labor market. Excuse me. So the cost benefits of minimum wage, the benefits of raising it are often overlooked or undercounted. The costs are emphasized, oftentimes exaggerated, even if they don't hold theoretical persuasion. Increases in demand, reductions in poverty, reductions in inequality, et cetera, just a few of the reasons to support it. It's rational, it's beneficial, it's desirable. Kind of wrapping up here, I'm not sure, am I pretty close on time? 3 minutes, okay, that's plenty of time then. So the topic of this debate was whether the minimum wages have benefits that outweigh the cost. I think that they do. I've tried to convince you that they do. I've argued that it does. I've pointed some empirical examples as to why it is, and some theoretical reasons as why. So the only reason really left is an ideological or theoretical sort of one, right? When we've all gone to, our micro classes, our intermediate micro classes, our public choice, we've all learned standard mainstream economic theory, right? And so we have sort of a selection bias as well. Really quickly, that's the last thing I want to point out as well. Some great work on the unemployment versus minimum wage thing contains the peer-reviewed selection bias that exists on the topic. So it's actually not a good thing to do and say, hey, look, I found 100 studies and 90 of them say that I'm right. It could be that those academic publications are actually biased in who they publish, what you're allowed to say when you publish these papers, et cetera, et cetera. So you're very more likely to be accepted if there's this mainstream economic theory that kind of supports the work that you're doing. You're very much more likely to get grants, to collect the data, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's statistically present, and there's been some nice papers written about that. So that effect is quite large, and publication bias is a real thing. Excuse me. So I've argued at least a couple reasons why. And so all I'm asking for really is a modicum of skeptical kind of consideration about our standard economic sort of training. It goes a long way. It's not like, neoclassical economics, it's good, right? In terms of, I think I've got a slide here somewhere. Let me see if I can go back to where it was. Right, so what neoclassical economics, not to just bash on it and say you guys are a bunch of dummies because you've been hoodwinked and cornswoggled by Dr. Willardson here to believe this, neo-fascist garbage that you want to be racist and disemploy a bunch of, minorities at the bottom end of the low-skill wage market, right? No, I'm not saying that, right? What it's good at doing, right, is establishing this idealized theoretical framework. And you can use that to analyze lots of stuff. You can build models. The models are great. The statistics are cool. The math is fantastic. but realize that they're idealized sorts of things. They're not real world, empirical sorts of things, right? So when your idealized theories don't conform with reality, it's not like I'm saying, I know he says that it's irrelevant and I should stop beating a dead horse, but it's not that it's irrelevant that they don't match up with the real world. You're left with two main options. You can do one of two things, right? When you realize that your theories don't match up, your predictions don't work well, you can try to argue for policies and regulations that force the real world to conform to your ideals, your values, your idealized theories, or you can do something else. You can change the theory, you can abandon the theory, and I say let's go for that one instead of the other. I'm out of time, so there you go.
Last one. We're almost done, guys. Okay, so pull this over. I do want to spend a few minutes talking about a few points that he's made repeatedly. He keeps talking about structural and frictional unemployment, how those aren't problems. That's not the case. Like, neoclassical economics actually recognizes that these are issues, at least for the case of frictional unemployment. That's why we laud things like LinkedIn and Monster.com and all of these other kind of mechanisms that allow people and employers and employees to find more efficient matches. Like, we absolutely consider frictional unemployment to be a problem, which is why we find mechanisms to reduce it. It's a transaction cost. Structural unemployment, we tend to have, I'm concerned, I don't understand why he keeps bringing it up, because minimum wage is one of the things that is a structural unemployment. It's exactly what I'm saying here, is that the minimum wage results in structural unemployment that is bad. I'm not exactly sure what it means when we say that neoclassical economists ignore that. I also want to point out that, yeah, increasing the minimum wage does hasten the automation. It absolutely does. Think about it from the perspective of an employer. If you now have a machine that shows up every day, doesn't complain, and you increase the cost of labor such that this machine now looks profitable, you will put in the machine. And ultimately, I want to end with the fact that, yes, the minimum wage, I think, does hurt the least among us. And if what we want to do is to help them, then give them an earned income tax credit. Don't take away their job, right? Because it's that job, the ability to get in the door, which is how they start to grow their productivity and their skills. I do ascribe to the productivity theory of labor, right? That you do earn your marginal productivity. And I think that that's completely been, there's a reason a doctor makes much more than a real doctor makes much more than I do. And I think that we see evidence of that consistently. And I guess I'm going to continue to push back on the idea that the theory doesn't match the empirics. Because at least with respect to the empirics that I'm looking at, how much more evidence do you need? Right? So here is the other one. This big spike here is just showing the axis. You can see this whole mass of point estimates. On the negative side, even his own meta-study is demonstrating the theoretical point I'm trying to make. Right? It is the case that there has to be some sort of quantity effect, but what I want you to recognize is that these point estimates are missing a bunch of stuff, right? They're looking at one thing, employment, or they're looking at one thing, and I'm telling you that an increase in the minimum wage affects many things, right? And because we are incapable, because we don't actually have access to the data, we can't look at all of these things together. Right? All of these things take place when we increase the minimum wage. All of them are bad on the very group of people that need it the most, right? And I want to finally end with the fact that he did bring up an important point. And I think that it's interesting that we should go back and look at the history of the minimum wage. It does have a checkered past. Sidney and Beatrice Webb put it plainly, with regard to certain sections of the population, the unemployable, this unemployment is not a mark of social disease, but actually of social health. Of all the ways of dealing with these unfortunate parasites, Sidney Webb in 1912 opined in the Journal of Political Economy, the most ruinous to the community is to allow them unrestrainedly compete as wage earners. a minimum wage was seen to operate eugenically through two channels, by deterring prospective immigrants and also by removing the employment of the unemployable who thus identified could be, for example, segregated into a rural community and sterilized. I mean, to some degree, they knew exactly what they were doing. The minimum wage did exactly what it was designed to do, was to kick a group of people out of the labor force. We can go further. This is Seeger, 1913. If we were to maintain a race that is to be made up of capable, efficient, and independent individuals and family groups, we must courageously cut off lines of heredity that have been proved to be undesirable by isolation and or sterilization. The minimum wage was considered to be a method to accomplish this, right? This is exactly what it was set to do. This is exactly what they tried to do in apartheid South Africa. Right? The first thing that they tried to do was make it illegal for people, or for African, I guess, black people they were from Africa, right? To work in certain, black Africans, to work in certain industries. And when that didn't work, immediately they turned to a minimum wage, right? Why? How does that work, right? Basically, think about it this way. Imagine that you have, you're walking through the grocery store and you see filet mignon and you have chuck steak, right? Everybody agrees that you would rather eat the filet mignon, right? So if that's the case, if filet mignon is better in every single aspect and in every single way, why is there even chuck steak? Well, there's a price differential, right? So in an effect, what's happening is the chuck steak is paying you for a lower quality in a sense. So what do you want to do? Imagine you make filet mignon. Effectively, what you would like to do is make it the case that everything has to be $9 a pound, right? If chuck steak is going for $5 a pound and filet mignon is going for $9, if I can get something passed that makes it such that every consumer has to pay $9 a pound, irrespective of the meat that they buy, well, that seems awfully beneficial to me. This is exactly how the minimum wage was designed to work. This is also why unions tend to support it, right? It increases their bargaining power. So think about it with respect. Imagine that I'm a high productivity earner, and it takes 3 underskilled workers to compete with me, right? So if those underskilled workers make $5 an hour, I, at most, can bargain for $15 an hour, right? Because it takes 3 of them. But if I can lobby to get their wage increased to, say, $7.50, now we're talking, was that $21, $22.50? Is my new bargaining power, right? Because it still takes 3 of them. If the employer has to pay them $7.50 apiece, and it takes 3 of them, that's $22.50, right? So my ability to negotiate went from 15 to $22.50. This is what I mean when I say the increase in the minimum wage benefits the more productive workers at the expense of the less productive workers. And you can see this consistently. Another reason that unions tend to prefer minimum wages is that their wage is directly tied to it in the contract, right? So the reason I bring this up is we get into, why do we have a minimum wage? If I'm right, why is there a minimum wage? If it is so obvious, why does it even exist? And there's a couple of different reasons. One, I think it gives politicians the ability to virtue signal and grandstand, that they're trying to help people. We've talked about that there are other subgroups that benefit from it. Ignorance is another example. Finally, you get the seen and the unseen. When we increase the minimum wage, we walk around the grocery store, we walk around the restaurant, and we see people who are working, making more money than they did several months ago. But what we don't see are all of the people that aren't there anymore, right? And finally, I think one of the reasons that we tend to see the minimum wage comes from thinking fast and slow. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Daniel Kahneman, but he has this concept of 2 brains, one which thinks fast and the other one that thinks slow. And effectively is that me? I apologize. So let's play a game, effectively. There is a ball and a bat. The combined price is $1.10. Okay? the ball is worth, or the bat is $1 more than the ball, how much is the ball? Your thought is 10 cents, right? Because that's immediately what jumps to your head. The only problem is that that's wrong. And as soon as you think about it, it's actually the ball is 5 cents because the combined price needs to be $1.10. The bat needs to be $1 more than the ball, so it's 5 and $1.05. Right? The point of this example is to demonstrate that the minimum wage is intuitively pleasing. It makes sense kind of on the surface, such that, well, if you want to help poor people, just raise their wage. Right? But if you don't sit back and think that there might be some sort of quantity effect here, it seems plausible on the surface that the end result would be that we're actually benefiting these people when we're in fact not. Right? I think that's actually the sum total of my argument. I have nothing more to say. We'll call it there. So what do you want to move to, like, questions?
Okay, so first, before questions, though, we're going to go ahead and put up the voting again. Let me find. So let me go ahead and clear the responses. If you guys still have the URL, otherwise we're creating a Word doc so you can see a little better. Let me check. I have to check on here.
Because there's some people that started with, because the winner is the one who changed the most. So the more you have, the less likely you are to change somebody.
Here's the oh.
Foundationally linked to racism. The people in the left would be happy to hear that we've got new allies in our right-wing bourgeois economies.
Full screen.
I would push back on the socialism tomorrow, but it's here. Capitalism's over. It's official.
I think I would probably push back on the, because, no, I mean, I think that effectively what you demonstrated is that you actually need some sort of government support to maintain institutional slavery. Because in these slave patrols, they were mandated by the South. You also had a lot of anti-manumission laws preventing people from actually freeing their slave, which again is another type of injury that is, I mean, basically what it is I would push back, because if capitalism is, you can, and again, the word we use, if the market society is one in which you can do with what your property, whatever you want, and then you have the government come in and say, well, you can't do that because that seems to be a government that is not one of the market. I mean, if what the reason that you can't free a slave at the time was because it would be too difficult to tell slaves free blacks from blacks, right? So they actually make it illegal to free them, which seems to be problematic, right? That to me doesn't seem to be a market failure. That's the government exercising some control.
Okay, so if you guys want to start voting, and also I'm going to open up to in-person questions. So if anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand.
Well, actually, can people online vote too?
Yeah, they could vote. I'm just opening up to questions here because otherwise it'll get kind of messy trying to mix. Well, I just, yeah.
Go for it.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
One question So you're worried about inequality among the capitalist class. I feel your empathy. I think that it is a problem because it's different. There's definitely different economies of scale, different businesses operating at different kind of.
Use the mic, yeah. Okay. It's on grab that one and then you guys can use.
Sure. I'll just hold it, actually. That'd be easier. So the question was in terms of, aren't there differences in the size and scope of different businesses? And for example, small businesses have a higher percentage of their cost structure tied up in wages, especially maybe minimum wage workers or lower skilled type employees. So it might be fine to raise the minimum wage for a multi-billion-dollar international corporation like McDonald's or Amazon or something like that, but it's much harder for mom and pop on Main Street, I think is the general gist of your question. I think it's a very good point. I mean, if you were to truly design an effective policy, that's probably something you would want to take into account. And not just to end there. I mean, you can make a minimum wage for corporations that employ over 1,000 people, over 10,000 people. You could make some kind of compromise, some kind of centrist dream come true, and whittle away kind of the effectiveness of that. But you probably wouldn't want a national minimum wage of, say, $15 or $17 an hour when the cost of living is so different in 50 different states, and then probably 50 different counties inside of each of those 50 states. It's difficult to pick one number that's going to count as a living wage. I think it was a good point you brought up at one point that the whole idea of a minimum wage, just to kind of piggyback on your question and respond to something that was said at the end, the purpose of a minimum wage is not to necessarily promote racism or things like that. The purpose nowadays of minimum wages is, of course, to try to help people at the bottom that the market is actually not sort of taking care of. And so, you know, it's not about helping or hurting anybody in particular. It's about actually setting a floor through which nobody's supposedly going to fall, right? If wages can go to zero theoretically, why not allow them to do it? Why not allow businesses to do that? Pay you 20 cents an hour, 25 cents an hour? Well, because you can't support yourself or your family, and society pays the cost in crime, in drug addiction, domestic violence, what have you. So it's true, right? It's the problem that you point out is definitely something to think about in terms of any policy that you try to do. And minimum wage is very problematic. And by the way, I don't even support minimum wages, so I was taking the side of an argument here tonight that I don't even really support. Like for me politically, I think it's a loser, it's a no-win kind of thing to go for. So hopefully you guys voted for me, and I'd be interested to see the results of that. But that's how I would respond. Hopefully I addressed your question. I'm not sure if I did, but if I were in charge of everything, if I were king, that's what you were also voting for tonight. You're electing me some position of power. I would definitely take that into account. You wouldn't want to say everybody pays a minimum wage, $22 an hour, even people who are making, you know, you got a business and maybe you make $5,000 or $10,000 a year or something like that. So it would be pretty ridiculous to do that.
No, I think that's actually a pretty good question. I just want to kind of add with respect to that, because I think it gets to the heart of the point, right? In fact, based off of that, that's also why you see Amazon, Walmart. So first of all, these large corporations already pay more than minimum wage everywhere. Walmart pays more than the minimum wage in every state, in every county in the country. Amazon has already increased its minimum wage. It's basically the premise of that question is why Amazon and Walmart are now advocating for minimum wages, because they know exactly what it will do to mom and pop shops, right? What better way to get rid of your competition is than to impose a cost on them that they otherwise can't absorb. I also want to point out that given the fact that he did feel like he needed to make concessions with respect to the size of a firm is actually implicitly accepting my premise, right? The reason that you had to make a concession. The reason that you feel like you need to make a concession is because he recognizes that if you increase the minimum wage beyond a certain point, there's going to be an employment effect. I do like the fact that, and that's the thing. And I think I agree with him in that a $15 minimum wage across the United States would be disastrous, right? Just because of the fact that, cost of living be damned. Right? Everybody gets 15. 15 in Alabama is not 15 in Seattle, which is why, a kind of a universal $15 minimum wage would be an absolute disaster. So, yeah, that's basically how I would respond to that. Yes.
Can I respond to your response?
You can respond to my response.
Yeah, I just want to respond to the response real quick. So, of course, I think there are employment effects even before you raise the minimum wage to $1 million an hour, right? Of course, if you raise the minimum wage to $1 million an hour, there's going to be huge employment effects. I agree with that. I also agree if you raise it from $725 to $825, there's probably going to be employment effects. I'm just more skeptical, I think, than my friend here as to can I predict what those employment effects are going to be? Because there are things like changes in demand that come about when people have more money to spend more money. There's not to bring macroeconomics into it, but there are other things that can happen in the economy. And I think you said also the ceteris paribus, of course. I hate that saying and expression. We live in a world that's not static and dynamic, and we have to relax the assumptions and unfreeze all the other variables that we hold constant all the time. So, of course, I don't feel any shame in conceding that there are employment effects at some point in the minimum wage.
Oh,
So there's great studies that show the increase in CEO compensation and people at the top of the quote unquote income inequality hierarchy, so to speak. This is kind of a normal feature. As our friend said, he really believes people are paid their productivity. He must really believe Jeff Bezos is worth the billions of dollars he earned this past 6 weeks with Amazon. I don't think anybody's really that marginally productive, but I don't believe anybody gets paid their marginal productivity to begin with. And so I'm sorry to have to say that in public, but call me crazy or ignorant or whatnot. But it's very interesting that these things are decoupled. For somehow, there's a labor market for low-skilled people, and they're subject to the supply and demand. But for some reason, we just can't really, I don't know, maybe there is a good explanation about why people at the top end of that aren't subject to the same discipline of the invisible hand of the free market.
Okay. So actually, yes. I mean, at least there's no empirical work that I'm aware of that looks at the effects of a minimum wage on like CEOs or anything like that. And in many cases, we would probably just assume that away. There is some work that has looked at how increases in the minimum wage might affect people in 1 or 2 wage brackets above there, right? And the reason for that kind of goes back to the mechanism that I described earlier. If you increase the wage of the lowest skilled workers, that actually increases the bargaining power of workers at 1 or 2 wage brackets above, right? So it makes it easier. So you have to think about it from the perspective of the employer. So I'm an employer. I can hire 3 underskilled workers at $5 a piece, and they're exactly as productive as 1 skilled worker at $15 a piece. If we can increase the minimum wage of those 3, my opportunity cost has now increased. He has more bargaining power, right? So in effect, yes, there's a mechanism that would suggest that it would make it easier for him to now get a higher wage out of me, even though his equilibrium wage is above the market clearing. You have a question? Oh. Okay, so basically you're going right at the heart of the marginal productivity of labor kind of concept. Well, first of all, I would actually argue that, I don't know about you, but 2-day shipping, pretty valuable. And if you consider the increases in productivity that Amazon as a structure, think about how many transaction costs Amazon has reduced, right? You have the ability to search millions of goods at the click of imagine a world without Amazon. Amazon has created the opportunity for many small businesses to actually sell their product, because most of the products you find on Amazon aren't Amazon. they're local retailers, right? So it's created a marketplace where millions of people can gather in effectively zero transaction costs, right? That is incredibly valuable. That's incredibly productive. And what it's done to the productivity of individuals has been enormous. So yeah, I would say that Amazon, Jeff Bezos, is worth every bit of the billions of dollars he's made. Now, we might be able to argue whether or not the $6 billion that he's made in the last couple of weeks, but again, I'm going to kind of fall back on this ceteris paribus. As it turns out, there's other stuff going on that might influence how much Jeff Bezos is worth right now that is unrelated to something like the minimum wage or normal market conditions, right? If you tell people that they can't go into brick and mortar, that's going to be good for online business. So with respect to that, it's not entirely clear because a few different things were, I mean, one thing I would like to point out is that there is kind of floating around this idea that an increase in the minimum wage will rise prices. And I have to be very specific about that, is it can't raise prices in general, right? And the reason for that is that the increased wages requires increased costs in the product and goods, but there's also a downward force on prices by the people that get laid off and they have no money to buy things. Right, so it's not entirely clear whether or not the general price level is going to go up or down. Further, I don't know, honestly. Presumably, yes. I guess if you push me back into a corner, I would say that increases in the minimum wage would make it more difficult to come out of a recession because it's effectively operating like a transaction cost. It's an additional cost put on the market, right? So it's creating artificial frictions that otherwise wouldn't exist. So, I mean, based off of that type of reasoning, I would say that, yeah, higher minimum wages are going to make it more difficult, right? Even Keynes understood this. The whole purpose behind inflating the money supply was to reduce the real wages, right? Because he thought nominal wages were sticky. By increasing the money supply, you're actually reducing the real wage right down below the equilibrium wage, right? I mean, by the very mechanism he prescribed to get out of a recession, it was implicit that you needed to lower real wages. So if you have a minimum wage, which is basically a restriction on that, it would seem like, yeah, that would be a problem to get back to full employment.
So yeah, another great question. I think that there are definitely some post-Keynesian probably problems with that interpretation of what Keynes advocated for. But that kind of aside, I think that macroeconomic kind of questions like that are kind of outside the purview of neoclassical, microeconomic focused sorts of things. So I would look to a different theory to kind of maybe try to explain that. I think probably the most important thing, and the reason why, we looked at a lot of reasons why you might not see these empirical results show up that are predicted by neoclassical economics. The reason why is because minimum wages and unemployment just might not be all that related. There might be other variables much more important. Like aggregate demand is going to determine how difficult it is to get people out of the unemployment situation in a recession. So somehow you have to change the folk psychology or their animal spirits, the herd mentality of the pessimistic kind of thing, and get the economy kind of steamrolling again. To get that demand, people want to buy the products, right? Whether you raise the minimum wage a quarter, $1, $2, or $3 an hour, the question most people who own a business have to answer is, can I sell some output? And is it profitable for me to do so, right? So they're not going to hire people or fire people just because, they got their panties in a bunch or something and they think that things are going to be bad in the future. They're just really upset that these liberal people got a hold of Congress and raised the minimum wage on them. They want to pay them back by cutting their jobs and sticking their butts on unemployment or something like that. They have to deal with the fact that they're trying to sell their output. And if they think they can sell their output, they're going to hire people to do it. And if it costs them more to do it, then it costs them more to do it, right? And so, Amazon, they're paying more than minimum wage now. That's because minimum wage isn't all that binding in the first place. Now, when I said that like some 30, close to 40,000 people would have been affected by the minimum wage, that's a lot of people, but that's a very small percentage of the labor force in general. So I think to keep that stuff in mind is probably, there's just, again, the ceteris paribus, when you relax that, there's probably dozens of other variables more important than the minimum wage to think about how are we going to get out of this recession or this economic downturn, or if the economy's heating up or slowing down too much or too fast. So.
We'll probably go ahead and take one more question, given time. And
Excuse me. So I really like that question. I think the answer is no, it's not just in economics. I think the field of economics struggles with it more publicly, more prominently than a lot of the other ones. There's a lot of authority, there's a lot of reverence and deference paid to academic economists. They've spent a lot of time doing research, they spend a lot of time getting degrees, training themselves, and so they pay I think they should probably pay more of a consequence for failures to predict or describe things well, but it's very public when that happens. But I think it's more or less a problem, not just of economics, but of social science, probably in general, or the philosophy of science in general. You made a great point about, what authority do we give to these statistics and these models that we build up? It's an epistemological question. How do we know? Like, how do I know how to convince you guys when I showed up here tonight that, my side was right or wrong? I think that, the way that you phrased it, I have very little problems with the way that you kind of brought that about. There is data, you take it, and then you have to use common sense at some time and try to decide what's right or what's wrong. But equally important to that is the theory that you use to interpret these kinds of datum and things like that. And so it's not a clear-cut thing where I can say, never trust Dr. Willardson again because he's revealed himself to be someone who believes in marginal productivity theory, and that's obviously just makes him insane. He's an insane person. He can't be trusted, right? That's not the point that I'm saying. There are times, you can be a, what do you call it, cafeteria capitalist or something. You can take parts of different theories and kind of use the ones that make sense and some kind of gut feeling or common sense sort of things. But the process, I think, is important to critically think about which times, and that's the main point I was trying to make in terms of the frictional. I didn't mean to harp on it or bring it up too much, but why is unemployment so bad when it's a result of minimum wages? When it's not like I think you think that unemployment's a good thing in normal times. It's not like mainstream economists are rooting for structural unemployment so people lose their job. But the policies that are promoted and the theory that's been developed tell you that it's nothing to be concerned about. They tell you that government regulation is a bad thing. It's going to hurt the people that you're trying to help because of these unintended consequences that you just can't possibly be smart enough to sort of understand. And that's what I'm hearkening to. That's what I'm pointing out. That at some point you have to call the bluff. Like when you sit down at a game of cards, eventually you're going to have to call somebody's bluff and say, nah, show me the card, show me where it's at. And that was the idea there. So, very well stated and put.
So good, you did the reading. No, so basically I would like to point out that with respect to that, Yes. I mean, the whole purpose was to demonstrate that, at least what I tried to do in the presentation, is that if you didn't buy the empirics, buy the logic, right? Because if you think about it, I'm not really assuming a model. I'm making one assumption. That's it. The only assumption I'm making is that there is diminishing marginal benefit, like that demand curves slope downward, right? Effectively, because if that's true, then if you increase the wage, like the only assumption I made is that there is a negative relationship between wages and the quantity of labor employed. I don't know how much more basic you can get, right? If you increase the wage, there must be a quantity effect. That quantity effect is going to hurt the lowest group of people at that wage. I mean, with respect to that, I don't know what else to do from, there's no other way to simplify it, right? That's it. That's the only assumption I'm making, right? This is why I keep saying, if you take any economist and you push them against the wall and you say, what happens if I keep raising that, even if they make some sort of statement with respect to, well, there appears to be no quantity effect over this range. Okay, well, let's jump to the next range, right? Then what? At some point, everybody concedes that you cannot continually increase the minimum wage. It's just common sense. There's going to be an employment effect, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? Now, I will concede that we can then quibble about how big that effect is, but I think that was the purpose of looking at the empirical work, right? That effect is pretty large, right? And we go back to the Seattle minimum wage study. It was large enough that it actually had a negative effect on average of about $120 some odd a month, right? And to the people at the very lowest rung of the wage scale, that's a lot of money, right? So that's probably how I would respond to that question.
One more question.
Okay, you can ask me a question.
Are you sure you made just one assumption? There's more than maybe one assumption you've made here tonight. Like, really, you honestly believe that's just the one thing that's sort of there, and the rest of neoclassical economic theory comes from that? Because I think maybe there's a few more, and that's a little bit of a sleight of hand. That's something, there may be one assumption you're willing to defend in public in a forum like this, but there's many more, and we all make them, and I'm not saying the other side does it and I don't. But it's, when I said it's a question of philosophy of science, I think it's super important to analyze the starting points and assumptions and where all this stuff flows from and comes from. So when you get people like me, hopefully you don't think I'm ignorant or too stupid, but you know, we can disagree about whether people are paid their marginal productivity, and we do it for different reasons. And likely the foundation of that, I think, is probably the assumptions where we start from and how we build the theories up from there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. What is your framework for analyzing the policy then?
Okay, I think that as a first course, like a rough approximation, I think I start with what I was trained with most frequency, and that's probably neoclassical economics. So I run it through that prism and I understand it. So the first thing I do is think about what the typical kind of results. I take the ceteris analysis, I do the ceteris paribus, the comparative statics, and I think about the normal kind of consequences that you would expect. I try to think about the unintended consequences that would come with it as well. But then I also run it through a few other quote unquote lenses of different perspectives, I think. And those come from anything, probably much more macro oriented than yourself, I would suspect, not to call out or anything like that, but I'm pretty interested in post-Keynesian economics and even left-wing, more radical heterodox stuff. Like, I don't know if we can say it in public, but we'll just keep it secret until the next debate when it's Marxism versus John Maynard Keynes. I think you listed him as a good neoclassical economist. And but an economist, not a good one, he said. He was off camera.
I do want to make one last statement.
Go ahead.
So,
Absolutely.
well, this is actually another question. It's a follow-up. Kind of. If we raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, what will happen?
What will happen? I say, as a good economist should, I'm going to talk on both hands. I don't think we can predict beforehand. I think if we raised it to something like $22 an hour, the effects would be much more pronounced. But if we raise it to 15, I'm not confident in saying yay or nay.
Okay, so
I think it's likely. I think it's very likely some people will lose their jobs. But I also think it's very likely that the people who gain an increase in wage actually come out better, that the cost-benefit analysis comes out as a net positive. Now, if you're a utilitarian and you think that society's best judged by the overall amount of good between everybody, that probably sounds like a good idea to you. If you're a more libertarian perspective and you've got a Pareto principle and you're thinking about what's ethical or valuable to the least among us or the individuals, that's a different way to interpret it. So that's kind of what I would say. So I would like to weasel out of it as well as I could, but I will make a couple predictions. And probably an overall net benefit, I would say. Oops.
Okay, so to wrap things up, we're just going to take a look at the poll to see if anything's changed. And it looks like it's loading in. Just a second. Maybe.
So we started at 54, so
I don't remember. No, I think it was. Again, I'm going to put.
So it looks like our final numbers right now are 39% in support and 61% oppose.
Yeah, but what was the original?
The original, I believe it was. Everyone gets a trophy. Okay, so I'd like to give a big thank you to both professors, and thank you all for coming out. I hope you all kind of had something new to take away from this, and
We should do it again.
definitely. Also,
UBIs or something. And I encourage, like, if any of y'all messages, it's hard to recognize because you're online.
Oh, stop recording.
I encourage you to get involved in that VCon.